8th and 10th grade, and it made our reading and math scores go right up to the top. It was good for the kids, too. No more social promotion. Just you got to earn it.
So speaking about education, this question came from Zach Garrettson in Florida. He would like to know your thoughts on Common Core standards and what would you like to do if you were vice president with the Department of Education?
Well, in Massachusetts, we had very high standards, and I think the Common Core would have diluted those. So in my capacity as a Massachusetts guy, I'm very much opposed to the Common Core because I thought it might be a race to the bottom. If I was in, one of the lower ranking states instead of in the number one state on reading and math scores, I might feel differently. So that's a question of where you stand, depends on where you sit. I think the Federal Department of Education, is considerably too intrusive in the U.S. education system. I would look much more to the states.
Okay, and I believe we're having some sound issues. Are those resolved? Okay. All right. So can we start back over since we may have missed some questions without some sound? Let us know, what are you thinking you're going to see tonight from the vice presidential debate? And by the way, Governor Weld will be live tweeting here from the Venetian Room in Atlanta, Georgia. So please go to Governor Weld's Twitter page and follow him to get those Twitter updates.
So what I'm hoping to see from Governor Pence is an explanation of whether Mr. Trump will plunge us into international crises through trade wars or nuclear proliferation, such as arming the Japanese and Koreans with nuclear weapons, and from former Governor Kane, now Senator Kane, whether he expects the Democrats will be able to resist spending and borrowing our society into the poorhouse. That's what I hope.
Mm-hmm. And if you're just joining us tonight, I'm Jess Mears. I'm here with Governor Bill Weld, Libertarian Vice Presidential Candidate. We are live streaming here on Facebook. If you have any questions for Governor Weld, please type them below in the live stream and we will get those answered for you. Okay, so here's a question that was submitted by Aubrey Irolls of Texas. Can you tell us, what have you been up to since you were governor of Massachusetts?
I've been traveling around the world a lot, both on business. I work for a bunch of Canadian companies that have interests all over the world. So I'm in Asia and Africa a lot, Latin America somewhat, Europe a bit as well. And I'm also a member of a group of former heads of state to which Bill Clinton is also a member. And they elected me because former President Clinton obviously doesn't always get to the meetings, and they like to have one Yankee, one gringo, one American to beat up on and to tell them what he or she thinks is going on in Washington. That's been a real eye-opener for me, getting straight from the shoulder what the former heads of state around the world think are the great issues of the day. So a lot of international travel. I also have a business consulting firm and a law firm, not mine, but that I work for, based out of Boston.
Thank you, Governor. Joe Iden in Florida says, if you were vice president currently, how would you respond to the threat that Hurricane Matthew currently poses to the East Coast?
Yeah, last I heard, it was right on the east tip of Cuba, so that's 90 miles away. Forewarned is forearmed, and it sounded to me it was a Category 4 last I heard. So I don't know to the extent to which sandbags, et cetera, are necessary to prepare for that in South Florida. But I also heard that it's going to be felt as far up as New England. So, disaster preparedness is the name of the game, and I assume and hope that the FEMA folks are all over this and the state authorities. Certainly we had our share of bad weather when I was governor in Massachusetts, and we worked well with the feds, and it's usually, Katrina is the outlier. Usually it's a very good relationship.
Thank you. And if you have any questions, if you're just joining us, please type those below and we will try to get those answered for you. Okay, this question comes from Aubrey Irolls of Texas. From 0 to not free to 10, completely free. How free are we tonight in America?
0 is not free. Yeah, I think we're at an 8, and to the extent we're not free, maybe a 7, because lack of economic opportunity really contributes to a lack of freedom. And in the economic area, Gary Johnson and I want to focus on equality of opportunity so that there's nobody stuck between a rock and a hard place, And I think the essence of a democracy is that the individual shall not be thrust in a corner. And the individual can be thrust in a corner by policy on purpose, but also by circumstance. So our whole approach is to try to unleash the energy and the skill sets and the abilities of everybody in society, and not have them blocked by the fact that the way is barred. So, the threats to liberty they include government, but they also include market dislocations which pen people in.
Thank you. And this question comes from Kyle Austin. Thank you for submitting your question, Kyle, and you may continue to keep submitting questions. What are your opinions and thoughts on philosopher Ayn Rand?
I've just read a little bit of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. I have to confess that I've not read all of either one. My libertarian readings, when I was just getting into the topic, were more Friedrich Hayek, both The Road to Serfdom and The Constitution of Liberty. And I think she did not really describe herself as a libertarian at the end of her life, even though those two books are the basis for a lot of libertarian thinking. So I'm not as knowledgeable as I should be. Gary Johnson is much more knowledgeable, but she obviously played a role of some centrality in the development of the philosophy.
So going off of that, what are some novels and books that have inspired you throughout your lifetime?
Well, I'm a great devourer of history and novels. I majored in Latin and Greek when I was at college and thereafter. And the wonderful thing about majoring in the classics, which is what those are called, is it doesn't ruin anything else for you. So I read a lot of history now. And if I'd majored in history, I'm not sure I would have been so keen. But I used to come home from the office, this is 25 years ago, and just sit down and read American history. I think I've read every book about American history that was written before 1980. A lot about the founding fathers and the adoption of the Constitution, and the whole generation of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, those folks, and then picking it up again in the Gilded Age, Civil War, of course. So I read a lot of history. And of course, it's influenced my thinking when I get in public life, what to do. There's a lot of object lessons in there. And I read a lot of literature. Nabokov and Borges are my favorite authors. And I read a lot of philosophy. Wittgenstein, Husserl, Heidegger, Gilbert Ryle, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. So I read quite a lot.
You do. You certainly do. This question comes from Alana Avance, and she would like to know, how do we get your polling numbers up so that Gary Johnson can get into the debates?
Well, Gary and I are, cascading around the country to the maximum extent of our ability. We're doing rallies, as you know, Jess, rallies, fundraisers, media appearances to tell our story, which is that we've got a platform no one else has. We're fiscally responsible. I'm not sure I would say the same of the Democrats. And we're socially inclusive and welcoming. I'm not sure I would say the same of the Republicans. We'll hear more tonight, of course. But when people really hear that and focus on it, a great number of them say, okay, well, in terms of doctrine and approach, I'm with you guys. And they ask the question you just asked, how come we haven't heard more about you? But we're doing absolutely everything we can. And while not in the debate tonight, we'll be live tweeting during the debate, so our voice will be heard. And I think the national media has been pretty good about giving us time. It's not the same as being in the debates, but we're doing everything we can to get the name recognition of Gary Johnson and Bill Weld up there. That's our only obstacle, really. It's not a qualitative one. It's a quantitative one. We just need to get Gary Johnson known by 70% of the American people instead of 35%, and then Gary would be at 30% in the polls.
Certainly, I agree. Okay, this question comes from Michael Jellison. And if you are out there just tuning into the live stream, please submit your questions for the Governor Weld, and we will try to get those answered for you. So Michael Jellison would like to know, what are your thoughts on the Federal Reserve? And that's an interesting question considering where we are here at the Hurt Plaza in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Venetian Room venue, which was actually the original Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta in 1914.
Wow. Well, the great question of the day is whether the Fed should have two functions, currency and employment. And I think a bunch of libertarians, and I haven't quite wrapped my mind around this, but think that it should revert to having only the currency function and not worrying about employment. But so I think a lot of people in the Libertarian Party are antagonistic towards the Federal Reserve and would like more freedom around currency as well. You know, libertarians tend to like Bitcoin and currencies that are not so squarely under the thumb of the Federal Reserve. My jury is a little bit out on that. I'm not sure I feel knowledgeable enough to say definitively that the employment function should be dropped off the sled.
Thank you. This question comes from J.G. Moorhead. And if you were vice president, what would you do about government corruption?
Well, I do the same thing I've done a lot of my life. I was a federal prosecutor for 7 years under President Reagan, and I made public corruption my #1 priority. And I got convictions in 110 out of 111 public corruption prosecutions that I brought in Boston when I was United States Attorney there for 5 years in the 80s. Then for 2 years, better part of 2 years, I was the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department in Washington, and made that the #1 priority nationwide, not just in Massachusetts. So I don't know that anybody's done more to advance the primacy of public corruption as an objective of the Justice Department than I have. It just drives me crazy, you know, when people get to public office and then they put their hand in the cookie jar. It just drives me nuts.
Thank you. And we're going to keep going for about 13 or 15 more minutes, so please keep submitting your questions for Governor Weld. This question comes from Allison Foxall. She would like to know, do you have any interesting or fun stories from the campaign trail that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, Gary and I both enjoy a good game of backgammon or chess or even pool along the way, and I must say he's proven to be more than a match for me. When I was younger, I used to play simultaneous games of chess blindfolded, meaning not looking at the board, keeping them all in my head, and I would generally win them all. So I thought I was in pretty good shape against Gary Johnson, who's picking hayseeds out of his ear, you know, asking me how the pieces move and that sort of thing. So we played at Gary's sister's house out in New Mexico, and Gary won. And then we were at my house in Massachusetts before shooting the 60 Minutes special, and the night before, and we played again, and Gary won again. So I'm very much chastened by that. We've had a bloody draw in pool, and in backgammon, I can't touch the guy. So, you know, he may come in pretending to be sleepy, but he's not.
Well, I've been following pictures, and it looks like you're having a blast out there.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so this question comes from Wendy Niederhauser, and she would like to know, what are your thoughts on term limits, and how would you implement them?
Well, I think term limits is really the only silver bullet that we have to make the folks in Washington start to pay attention to doing the public's business down there. I mean, the two parties have this poisonous relationship. It's like they're in a death spiral embrace. You know, they hate each other, they want to kill each other. They're united only in terms of wanting to preserve their monopoly so they can all get reelected. And it's the obsession with reelection that I think makes people take their eye off the ball and think, oh my gosh, I've got to be the most conservative Republican I can, or someone will run against me in the primary. Same on the other side, left wing, left-hand side of the Democratic Party. Term limits, you could have 2 terms in the Senate. That's a long time, 12 years. 3 or 4 terms in the House, 6 or 8 years. That's also a long time. But then move on and let somebody else come in. Because, you know, when people just can't think of anything except getting reelected, and it means that they're always campaigning. You know, they're not paying that much attention to what's going on in Washington. So when I was governor, I was the national co-chair of U.S. term limits. 2 things I did were the National Privatization Council and United States term limits. I worked with Howie Rich, who's still very active in the term limits movement. And Gary and I feel equally passionately about term limits. So you can bet that we would beat the bully pulpit and the tambourine and anything else we could beat in support of term limits restrictions on members of Congress. Most governors are now term limited. Nobody misses a beat. It's fine. 8 years. See you later. Thanks for the memories.
Sounds great. So we've been hearing a lot from Donald Trump and Mike Pence about their plans for immigration. What are your immigration plans?
Well, just the opposite. I mean, Gary and I think, and I'm sure we're right, the economists all agree with this, that immigration is actually good for the United States economy as a labor force issue. It helps get the work done, and it helps enlarge the scope of the economy because more work is getting done and paid for. And I just think Mr. Trump has perpetrated a fraud on the U.S., making everyone fearful that all 11 million undocumented people who have emigrated to this country want to jump the line and become citizens of the U.S. overnight. That's not true. Most of those people just overstayed their visa. Maybe a few or more than a few are here on work visas. We want, and Gary Johnson often says, we want to make it easier for people to get a work visa and contribute to the economic vitality of the United States. And yes, pass a background check, and yes, get a Social Security card, which means yes, they can pay taxes, and yes, they can get a driver's license, so if they have an accident with you, their insurance will pay for it. Just to be on the other side of that debate is to say we want to have a big number of people living in the shadows inside our border. That makes no sense to me.
So this question comes from Christopher Osborne, and he would like to know, what would you do to help veterans get quality health care? And if you're tuning into live stream, Governor Weld is answering your questions, so please type them below. Thank you.
So the GIs coming back from World War II had two sets of needs, education and health care. Education, they did the GI Bill, which is a voucher program, so everyone chooses where to go. Tremendous success over the decades. Healthcare, they did the opposite. They said command and control, one size fits all. You have to go to a VA hospital and do it our way, and the government will be in charge of everything. Nobody can deny that the doctors and workers at the VA hospitals are among the most dedicated people in the service of the United States, and they care about those veterans. They're tremendously dedicated, but at the same time, the quality of care there, available there, to say nothing of waiting lists and being pronounced dead by mistake, et cetera, it's not the equal of the top private sector hospitals in the U.S. So, and sometimes veterans have to travel 4 to 5 hours to get to a VA hospital. That's ludicrous. We should give them a piece of paper that says you have the opportunity to go where you want to get the care that you can show that you need. That would be more along the lines of the GI Bill. And I'm not saying blow up the hospitals, but the VA hospitals, that is. I think we need to get more individuals acting for themselves, kind of like in the healthcare area in general. I like the idea of health savings accounts, so people can plan for their own healthcare costs and decide what they want to do. The poor vets, there's been a lot of publicity to it, the 9-month waiting lists to get an operation, and I just think if you gave them a voucher, it would address the situation very quickly.
Okay, and we have a question from Lorenz Iverson. And what would be your primary focus if you were Vice President of the United States?
Well, I mean, Gary knows I have an interest in foreign policy and international matters, so I'm sure I'd have some involvement there. But the first thing we would focus on, both of us, and we agree on this is item number one, is balancing the budget, submitting a balanced budget in our first 100 days, maybe even our first couple of months. And people in Washington say that takes 7 or 9 years because they don't have the political will to make changes. And Gary and I, both of us, our first elected job was governor. So I like to say we didn't know there were any sacred cows in the budget. We didn't even know that they were cows, much less that they were sacred. So, if something deserved to be cut, we would cut it. We wouldn't listen to the screams. And there's always 100 people telling you 200 reasons why you can't do something in a state capital or in Washington, and you just have to have the political will to plow straight ahead. And that would be Gary's and my number one issue, the budget, which leads to deficit and debt.
And this question comes from Austin Houts, and we are live on Facebook right now, so please keep submitting your questions. Governor Weld, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream?
Oh, I think probably pistachio.
All right. So let's see.
I was trying not to salivate.
Ice cream does sound good right now. Okay, so let's see. We got to get some more questions in, so please keep getting them in. What do you expect to see tonight that you would please you?
Well, I'd like to see some agreement among the current governor and the former governor that someone's got to get to Washington and tackle the budget, which is way out of control. When President Obama, because governors do that sort of thing, and they've both been governors. And when Mr. Obama leaves office, our national debt will be $20 trillion, and half of that is Mr. Obama's. And Mrs. Clinton, embracing a lot of Senator Sanders' proposals in this year's campaign, has pledged so many spending programs that if she got in for 2 terms, I dare say the national debt would be $50 trillion. And, you know, 10 trillion here, 20 trillion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. So I don't mean to make light of it. It's a serious national problem that will undermine, hollow out our economy and hurt on the jobs situation.
This question comes from a submitter earlier in the day, Risa Willis, and we talk a lot about reducing the size of government as libertarians. Which roles of the government do you see being beneficial and that should remain?
Well, our purpose is to keep people free, so make sure bad things don't happen, and to restrain people from injuring each other, and that takes you to places you wouldn't think of as libertarian. You know, a degradation of the environment harms people, and it's important to keep that from happening. In the healthcare area, you know, I'd like to see more of a shift in favor of preventive programs as opposed to, you know, saving all the money for hugely expensive operations after things have already gotten out of control. So if there were preventive health programs that were working well, you know, I might multiply that appropriation by 20 because it's saving money and it's improving healthcare costs.
And this question comes from Earl Jones, and we have a little bit more time for just a few more questions, so please get those in now. Earl would like to know, which attributes do you have that you'd say complement Governor Johnson and vice versa?
Gary and I actually have been talking a lot about policy issues all year. We've influenced each other. He's influenced me on criminal justice reform. Certainly I'm with him now on legalization of marijuana. I might not have been 10 years ago, but I see it now. I see that we need to treat addiction issues as a healthcare emergency rather than issue number one for criminal justice. You know, mandatory minimums. I see Gary's side of it. I think in the foreign policy area, I think he agrees. Actually, he agreed anyway about environmental affairs being important. And that we need to be engaged. We can't just turn our back on the world. He does insist, and he's brought me along on this, that we need to have a policy of restraint and non-intervention when it comes to regime changes such as Iraq, Syria, Libya. You know, those are 3 recent examples, and I think Gary has really been something of a hero in bringing that attention up on the national radar screen.
So speaking about foreign policy, when do you think war is justified?
Well, of course, if we're attacked, we need to fight back. Wars of aggression where we go in first and start shooting up, you know, I think we got to give some thought to that. We can't do it every time we see another government doing something we don't approve of, or we just would be doing it all the time. In fact, the United States has been at war in one part or another of the world for much of the last 40 years. You know, we think of ourselves as a totally peaceable nation because we don't conduct wars to grab territory and keep it. But that's not the only question. If you're frequently on the aggressive side of war, initiating war, you're not really that peaceable a nation. And that's inconsistent with our self-image. We think of ourselves as a very peaceable nation, and I think that needs to get some more thought given to it.
So this question is coming from Justin Carlton, and he would like to know your stance on the Patriot Act.
I think the Patriot Act is the one that regulates how much the FBI can collect information about people and says you got to give your Social Security number in this, that, and the other circumstance. It became very controversial because government officials were going to local librarians and asking, who's taken out this, that, or the other book. That's not a good idea. And even Congressman Sensenbrenner, who was one of the original authors of the Patriot Act, I think has participated in bringing it back a little bit. It's the same issue that Gary Johnson often raises about the NSA, too much spying on Americans. And I think it's got to be cut back even somewhat more. That's where I am.
Okay, and I think that's going to be our last question for the evening because we are out of time. I would like to invite everyone to join Governor Weld tomorrow evening at 7:30 in the Venetian Room here in Atlanta at 50 Hurt Plaza, and the doors will open at 6:30, so you're welcome to join us if you're in the Atlanta area.
It's a beautiful venue. Come on in.
And Governor Weld, will you lead us out tonight by inviting everybody to follow you on Twitter for the vice presidential debate?
Yeah, please do follow. During the debate, we'll be live on Twitter, and just sign in Gov Bill Weld.
Thank you so much, Governor. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Jess.